the metrics industrial complex. Just buy this product, glue it into all your systems, and we'll tell you what's happening in your org. And it's like, yeah, I don't think that's how it works.
Welcome, folks. In today's episode of Hangar DX, we're going to do a special. This is our special edition where we have Adam Berry and me, and we're going to talk about metrics and developer productivity metrics and everything which is wrong with it and what we can do about it. Before that, let's introduce ourselves. I'm Ankit, co-founder and CEO of Aviator. We build developer productivity tools for improving your entire software development lifecycle, going from code reviews to merges and deploys. Adam, please introduce yourself as well.
Sure. Yeah. I'm Adam Berry. I'm currently at Netflix, but I've been, I think it's fair to say, all over. An entire career basically in everything from IDE plugins to at scale delivery systems and all the stuff in between. So just like how do individuals and orgs ship software? That's what I do.
Very cool. And Adam and I know each other now for over 2 years. Have gotten to learn a lot from Adam, and I'm hoping this will be a fun conversation and hopefully casual. So maybe we just start with like Adam trying to understand a little bit of history. Like, how did we get here? Like, what's the obsession with productivity metrics? How kind of like what is the industry doing today? And then we'll kind of like go more specific into what we are trying to achieve.
We can track this back to sort of roughly the Accelerate book, right? And so that takes us back to almost 10 years now,
Mm-hmm.
effectively in time. And that was where we actually got the birth of sort of the Dora 4 metrics, right? And I think that is like the origin point where people were like, hey, there is in fact stuff that we can measure here. And it does in fact seem to correlate or even and actually, sorry, have a causal relationship with teams that are able to deliver value. And so this, I think, was like the gateway into everyone's obsession with, hey, if we can just like really build some great metrics, we can figure out how to like just be way more productive. I think that's where it started. And like totally, I will cop to, and actually I still am. Like I think the Dora 4 metrics are very, very good mechanisms for feedback for a team to improve. Which is what they were actually originally sort of
Right.
about, right? This is how you can sort of figure out how you need to get better so that you can deliver more value for your business, right?
Right.
It wasn't ever supposed to be here's how we can think about delivery across an entire org. It was never supposed to be here's how we can compare performance of teams. We started there, we started building additional metrics, and we got way off of them being a feedback loop. And I think that's
Interesting.
kind of so. I think that's like how, to me, like at a very high level, this kind of started to go a bit sideways.
Well, so there are like a few other things I would like to mention, given that you've already touched on these things. One is I wonder whether this was before Accelerate or after, but I also remember Martin Fowler at some point said, you cannot measure productivity of developers. That's a
Right.
fool's task, fool's errand, and we should not try to do that.
Yeah.
Um, and then kind of like it goes into a little bit more details about like, why you cannot measure. And this was at least 10 years ago, and I don't know whether this was before or after Accelerate. And I think the second part, maybe I'll mention worth mentioning is if you go to Dora website, I think it's Dora.dev. If you go there, they talk about these are not productivity metrics. These are
Right.
software delivery performance,
Right.
right? Like, and I think people start from the right mindset. It's like Dora metrics are good, like software delivery performance metrics, and then
Mhm.
kind of like, oh, now that we're measuring this, let's also measure a bunch of 100 other things, and kind of like get a better perspective on how our software engineering is doing, and that turns into developer productivity metrics.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, and I remember that piece that you're talking about from Fowler, and I think a little bit what he was getting at is economically, right? Productivity has a defined meaning,
Mhm.
right? Like, it means essentially the value add based over the cost of inputs, right? So yeah, when we sort of phrase it that way, we're like, how on earth would we figure out how to understand the productivity of an individual? For sure, and even a team, like that's in pretty much all engineering orgs. That's
Mhm.
you're not gonna pull that off, right? Um, but it's like an interesting thing because we sort of take that word and we sort of it ends up losing all meaning because we're sort of talking about effectiveness or efficiency or just hustle. right? And we're sort of like, bannering all of those under just like this productivity term, and
Right.
then like dangling all of these metrics off of it. So it's like it gets really difficult to talk about because we've just mixed all of this stuff up, I think, a
Right.
bit too much.
Right. Okay, so now let's kind of like come to the current state, right? There are many different terms that are thrown around, which I feel like kind of are also related to developer productivity, but has different colors, and I don't know which ones make more sense versus the others. So there is engineering enablement, there is developer experience,
Mhm.
and there is platform engineering. I guess like maybe there are like orgs within these companies which kind of like have these functions, and I don't know whether developer productivity is just like their mandate, or kind of like there are some nuances to it that are worth noticing.
Different companies have chosen different flavors of this, right? So, like, if you walk around, as I know you do, right? You walk around the industry. So, like, I know you talk to platform teams, you'll talk to experience teams. I even seeded a team called Development Reliability Engineering at one company. So, like, there's all sorts of names that get thrown to this, right? I think those are like different lenses of roughly the same set of questions. A little bit how like DevOps versus SRE is like just two slightly different lenses to think about like how we think about like engineering of infrastructure and delivery at scale. Like, because that's really what they're both about, but they're just two slightly different filters. And I feel the same way about like all of these different terms. Like they all have
Mhm.
validity, but which one you choose probably says something about your culture, because there's going to be a lineup of like your filter to your culture. And that's fine. Like that's
Right.
okay. Um, but I think in all of them, I think we've still lost as we've added these additional metrics, the point that this is about feedback to a team
Mhm.
to get better, right? Like that is very typically difficult to get at and difficult to
Hmm.
see.
Interesting. So I know we also pre-show talked a little bit about this, but one way to maybe try to think about is, why are we obsessed with metrics? Why are they
Mhm.
important? I mean, I understand, yes, like some part of goal is like, okay, how do we get better collectively as a team? But I do feel like there is more to it than that. I feel like, especially in the last 5 years, this really escalated during COVID when people started working remotely. I mean, at least my hot take is that it is also because of insecurity of the managers, right? Like in some ways they're trying to figure out, how is my team doing now? I don't have enough control, especially if they're working remotely, especially if they're working asynchronously. Maybe that's also the factor that they're trying to understand what's going on, and maybe they're using some of these metrics as a lens to understand that world.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of where it starts. I mean, it's worth sort of remembering that essentially there's two questions that we want to answer. Are we as an org able to ship as frequently as effectively as we like so that we can support the business? And is life for an individual developer in this org good?
Hmm.
That's basically like at the core of this, at the core of all of this, it's those two questions. It's very, very difficult to answer those questions, right? It's just like the questions are simple, but I don't mean to imply that this is an easy problem. Like it really, really isn't. But I think what you're starting to get at, right, is that we sort of accepted that it's like basically impossible to measure directly productivity. So now we have to trust our leaders and our management to effectively manage the narrative here. So you really do have to trust. I actually can tell you that like in some low trust orgs that I've been in, this gets worse. They get more obsessed with data in low trust orgs, which makes a ton of sense when you start to
Right.
think about it this way. Because if you don't have like a solid trust foundation in your org, you're going to be like, yeah, the only thing I can do is start to figure out data to kind of like justify my team, to justify why we've slipped, to justify hiring another engineer, like for all sorts of reasons, right? The managers or the leaders don't feel like their assessment or their narrative will be accepted. So they feel like they have to go back it up. But then they
Right.
get lost and they forget about the narrative and they get stuck in the numbers, right? So you end up with the other problem.
Right. And I think it kind of like just double clicking on that. If you are if you're like the frontline manager, you would very likely also want to know how my each individual person is doing. And I feel like
Mhm.
those are the things which can get really messy,
Yes.
especially if you don't understand how to interpret these numbers, right? So, for instance, is the person who's writing the most code the most efficient person in the team? The more senior you get as an engineer, right, you're probably writing more time in docs. You're probably trying to solve bigger, more complex problems, trying to enable other developers in your team, right? Your responsibilities change.
Right.
And given how complex this whole software development is, some of these things are extremely hard to measure, right? So if you're just measuring, okay, how much work was done, like kind of like as if we are like factory labor workers, um, it can kind of really show a very wrong picture for an individual.
Yeah, absolutely. Completely agree. To use the old joke from Bill Gates, right? Like measuring software by amount of code is like measuring an airplane by weight. So what are we going to do? We're going to measure this by like how much weight somebody adds to the airplane, which is like effectively what we're saying. It's like, no, this doesn't feel like a sensible way of viewing it. And it's like, of course, like to actually understand what the impact of any individual is difficult. The unfortunate truth is that's the job, right? If it was an easy job, anyone would do it, right? Like that's sort of, there is just a truth to that, that it's like, yeah, this is difficult. And we should be trying to use like data to flesh out the picture, but it's like we should never ever just like completely switch over to it, ever, really ever.
Right. There was an interesting term that you were using for defining this organization for metrics, right? What was that?
The metrics industrial complex, because in the last few years, our profession has gotten sufficiently obsessed with this that we now have several companies who are selling metric systems as products. And there's slightly different, views on those. And I've been around them. Some I think are still useful and good. Some I think are actively probably quite harmful, kind of by design, unfortunately. But there are at least 4 or 5 of them that I can think of off the top of my head, right? That are sort of fed into this notion of like, just buy this product, glue it into all your systems, and we'll tell you what's happening in your org. And it's like, yeah, I don't think that's how it works. One of the things that it's actually really falls apart on a bit, and it actually gets into this question of like individuals and outputting code. Code is an extremely lossy representation of the work happening in your organization. So if you build a system that's like, I'm going to measure the effectiveness of my organization by only considering metrics that are then proxies against code, and we know code is a lossy representation, it's exceedingly unlikely you're going to get a decent picture at the end of the day that has any relationship to the truth. If you build a system that's like, I'm going to measure the effectiveness of my organization by only considering metrics that are then proxies against code, and we know code is a lossy representation.
Right. Yeah, I mean, as a software engineer, you're probably spending less than half of your time actually writing code. A big part is really like problem solving part is actually not about writing code, right? It's a lot more about understanding the problem, understanding the scenarios, the corner cases, the bigger picture. Like how does it fit into the bigger picture?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, I think, 2 of my favorite thinkers in our profession, Kent Beck with TDD. I think you can make the argument that the T stands for thinking. It doesn't really stand for test. It's a set of rituals that's like, here is how you think about doing your work, right? And it's like giving you a ritual and a process for doing it. And then I remember years ago there was a talk that Rich Hickey, the guy who started Clojure, uh,
Hmm.
talked about hammock-driven development. He's like, literally, he's like, don't write code, go lie in a hammock for a while, and then come back and write some code because you'll have solved a bunch of it by just thinking about it. Um,
Interesting.
and I mean, that's obvious. And he admitted at the time, like it was an extreme view and you shouldn't really do it. But it does sort of like get at this thing of like folks in our field who've done this for a long time, who've written about it, who've been successful are like, yeah, you probably want to spend some time thinking. And we're not really going to capture that in any sort of like output.
Right. Yeah, I mean, like there is this whole concept of rubber duck, right? Like you kind of
Right.
like just try to explain the problem to a rubber duck and kind of like take that time to think.
Yeah.
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah. For sure.
So let's kind of like actually get a little bit more into the weeds. And I would love to maybe also start thinking a little bit about where is the place of metrics if there are like some of these challenges, right? I mean, there is at least some value, right? Like even if it is not entirely about measuring developer productivity, I feel metrics are fundamentally useful for understanding how your, again, like maybe delivery performances or like in general, how your where are the inefficiencies in your organization when it comes to processes. There are also other interesting nuances to it. For instance, we talk about like, okay, build times. So this is definitely an interesting one, right? Where build times are important because you want like faster feedback for the
Right.
developers, right? Like if they're waiting for too long, performance can be degraded. But at the same time, when the builds are running, it's unlikely like developers are just like waiting for it to finish. Maybe they'll kind of like switch over and start doing something else. So is that even like relevant when we think about like improving productivity?
It absolutely is. It's always useful to kind of go through an exercise of, and maybe you don't do the full value stream map, but you do like
Mm-hmm.
at least a chunk of it that's like, this is our process. And then you sort of combine that with like a view of how many work threads are allowed to be spun up per individual across your value stream. Like, and when you sort of read like project to product by McKerson, like some of these other places, like this is the view that you start to get at. No, no, no. Actually, what you fundamentally want to do, and I think what you're getting at is understand your engineering system and how something goes from like an ask to shipped, and actually even more to have we learned that we've gotten value out of this on the end, right? But the reason I sort of like to start there is because actually it's quite unusual for builds to be the thing that is in fact the bottleneck. It's the thing that often developers will complain about, but that's not the same thing as like what the actual bottleneck in the system is. I think if it's relatively easy, which means you've done good work on requirements, like you've got good chunking, you've got like good separation, you've probably done a bunch of architectural work. So like, yeah, you probably can then thread to maybe 4 or 5 of these tasks kind of at once. So then if something blocks up, you can be off doing something else. But that's a thing that you can only figure out by actually inspecting what your current stream is and your current ability to kind of like add throughput on the system. And it is actually also a little bit where the Dora 4 is a pretty reasonable starting point because effectively the Dora 4 gives you what is your throughput, your latency, and your failures, right? So like it is a good starting point as a way as you're building that mapping to kind of like add some like a quantitative view as where your bottlenecks and your drops might be.
Let's kind of like do this exercise then, right? Assume you joined an organization, hypothetical organization, where you're asked to kind of like design some of the metrics which will help understand like the efficiency of the organization when it comes to delivery. um, how would you go about doing that? Like what would be your sort of like, in some ways the blueprint to doing metric designing, I suppose?
Even though I've just said the Dora 4 is normally a good question, I'm actually going to take one step back and say we should do the thing that we should always do as software engineers, and we should gather requirements. What that really is going to get you into in any organization is like, why is this being asked? Like, what actually is it that folks are trying to solve for? Because as with all things that we do, whether we're shipping software or we're mutating our processes or anything, if we just dive in, we don't have a good chance of actually meeting the need or the actual requirement. So it, as always, it starts at, okay, if this is the thing that we're inspecting, what is it about our org, what's in the water as to why folks want to inspect this? And that typically starts to get you into like the real work of like designing. And you'll normally hear we can't ship quickly enough, or whenever we try to do a deploy, it falls over and we're all in an incident room for 2 days, right? Or the product's just super slow and like, but we can't figure it's like there'll be something that'll be sort of felt that people can kind of describe like, no, this is the problem that we're trying to solve for. It still often ends up that the Dora 4 is like a very reasonable first answer, but it's still go back and ask that question first. I guess maybe you could land in a place where it's like, oh yeah, we're shipping quickly enough. We've just got this slight quality problem. Like here, like, but I've never seen it. Like they do tend to go together.
So okay, let's say we have like gathered certain requirements, right? Assuming most of these things typically be around like we can't ship fast or like things are unreliable. I think like unreliability is also a very common issue that happens in organizations, right? Like
Yeah.
maybe there's like some test infrastructure issues, or you have like flaky test, or maybe there isn't enough test written. There is like kind of people just like deploy and assume everything works well,
Mhm.
right? Kind of like being very optimistic about it. So what do we do with that, right? I mean, kind of like, is this a symptom of a bigger issue, or like kind of like where does one even start to kind of like really understand the layers here?
So let's say we have a quality issue. You dig into it a little bit And you're like, okay, well, we just have like no tests like that. I mean, like maybe there are tests, but we'll say none, but what we normally mean is like our coverage is just really woefully inadequate. And here's where like I think it's important to think about metrics as feedback mechanisms,
Mm-hmm.
because you don't want to set a standard for code coverage. What you want, or like number of tests or feature coverage or whatever. But what you can do is be like, okay, we have a quality issue. It is described by these product outcomes. It could be like imports, inbound support calls. Like there'll be something from the business that says this is representative of our quality problem, right?
Hmm.
So that's metric A, right? Because you're trying to move that. And then you're like, okay, so now we're going to choose a couple of things that we want to move so that we can tackle that number, right? So, and in tests, it's a really good example because you would want to increase coverage, but you have to also be mindful essentially of like build time and build
Mm-hmm.
failures at the same time. And so what I've just described now is like a target thing that we want to move, but also two numbers that act as guardrails so we don't get out of
Hmm.
control and we don't kill ourselves trying to do this. And so basically, as you're trying to solve a specific aspect of your system, business impact number that you want to get, a target that you as a team that you can orient around, and then a couple of numbers that act as guardrails to make sure that you're not causing other problems for yourself as best as you can manage. Engineering orgs are incredibly complicated systems. There's no way to completely tease these out, but like just a sort of thought framework, this is how I
Yeah.
think about
That's really cool. Actually, you brought up a very interesting point, and this kind of like also falls into like an example is like Goodhart's law, which is like if you have one metric only and you're trying to improve that without any guardrails, you end up very likely going to make things worse. And like actually, this is also probably why Dura metrics actually works out as a great set of four metrics. It's not like a single metric, right? Like it's four metrics which work in tandem.
it.
So
Right.
if you ignore one metric, sure, you can have a deployment frequency of every commit, but like maybe your systems are not reliable enough, and like out of those every commits, like you're essentially dealing with fires all the time and having like a very high change failure rate.
Right. Yes. You're prone to a couple of things, right? It's like if you can directly move the metric, that's really super bad. That's really, really super bad because people will, guaranteed. And then, yes, like you want to have something else. And then that is sort of why the Dora 4 are good, is because they're composites. Each of the numbers in there effectively, like there isn't a way for an individual to tilt that number, right? Like
Hmm.
the only one that you could maybe tilt is deploys a day, right? Like you could just smash code into the system and hit the button and get more and ship more, right? So that's kind of the only one that you can hit directly. But as you said, if you've got the others that act as sort of, this guardrailing feedback mechanism, you're probably not going to do that because you're going to cause other issues that will flare. So,
Interesting. So for somebody who's like trying to think about like designing these metrics, is there a framework to think about how to define the guardrails?
I don't know if I've ever seen it like kind of formally built down.
Maybe it's like you just think about, okay, what could possibly go wrong?
It's more like, okay, if we do this, what are the likely sort of side effects of that? So like in the tests example, right? Okay, we had a bunch of tests. Well, there's a solid chance our pipeline's going to take longer now, and maybe we're not okay with that, right? But like
Yeah.
that natural consequence then is like, oh, okay, so now I want to bound the pipeline execution time, and I want to use that as like a forcing function to how I think about tests. Um, oh yeah, if we add tests that are only like integration or end to end, they will both take a long time and probably also be flaky. And we don't want to deal with flaky tests because we don't want to be digging through that all the time, right? So like reliability of the tests in the pipelines, like that's how it sort of drops out. So yeah, I think it's mostly just like, okay, we know now that we want to move this number.
Hmm.
Let's think about if we do this work, let's think 4, 6 months out, if we've done a bunch of it, like what might have happened
Hmm.
and what of that space that we can think of, but we're like, that cannot happen. We must not let that happen. And then measure against it. If you can.
Int-
You might not be able to, but if you can.
yeah. I mean, I guess like some of it is also intuitions, right? I think it's kind of like, and the experience,
Right.
which is like, okay, we have done this. We know how this kind of like turned out last time, and from those mistakes we will learn, and like this time we will have defined better guardrails.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. There was also this one thing, and I don't know what you think about it. I heard it from someone, which is metrics are only useful to the point where you kind of like are improving things, and
Mhm.
after some point you should probably just like stop reading those metrics every day,
Yeah.
and kind of like in some way sort of like maybe just hide them. Like part of the, I think, rationale there was also, you know, if you improve your build time from 10 minutes to 9.5 minutes by spending 4 months of engineering time, like it's not very worth it.
Right.
But if you kind of like go from like maybe 20 minutes to 10 minutes, it might still like it would probably improve significantly like value for your developers.
Yeah.
So what is your thought process on that? Like, I mean, is there like a lifetime of a metric?
I mean, not in like a defined for like this is the boundary that I would think about, but I think it is. You should be thinking about what your end state is
Mm-hmm.
for these numbers, right? I think again to lean on the sort of testing example, 100% coverage isn't the goal, right? We know if you've been around 80-ish is what you're shooting for, give or take, right? Like maybe for some systems you can tolerate a bit less, for some other systems you can be like, no, I'm gonna need a bit more. But like there's this like 80% ish, like using it as a feedback mechanism absolutely has a lifespan, right? Like I'm trying to improve our testing story, and then I'll sort of move it into monitored but not a feedback mechanism.
Hmm.
Because for testing, this is definitely one that you wouldn't want to regress too far, right? So like, and if it did suddenly dip back to like 50%, you'd be like, okay, we're going to do it again now, right? Like, and you go back into feedback mode. What that starts to get you at is not all metrics are equal. They don't all have equal prominence. You will have different cycles of looking at them based upon the role that you wish them to play for you as a team. I think some of these products, and I've seen them where you go in and then there's like 40 metrics on a single dashboard. You're like, what is important here? I have no earthly clue what I'm trying to do. I think they definitely do have a lifespan. And I think that basically comes down to when you're starting the process of trying to install feedback, you think about what success is. And you're like, okay, if we get here and we sustain this for this period of time, we'll shift it into
Pull it
background.
out.
Yeah, we'll shift it into
Interesting.
background.
So just to summarize, kind of like so far what we've discussed, I think it's important to kind of like really understand what the like requirements are. And when we think about requirements, do you think it's useful to get requirements from the management? Do you think it's useful to get requirements from your boss? Do you think it's important to get requirements from individual developers? Who are the stakeholders? Like, who are we getting these requirements from?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think normally basically everybody is really the answer to that question. It's going to be the whole org on one level, or like product or sales. It depends a little bit where you sit in the org, right? Like what your role is in the business. Um, Certainly, essentially, like your frontline stakeholders. Like, what is it that we're not doing well enough for you that we need to improve? That's the
Mhm.
conversation. That's like the key conversation with the stakeholders. Your sort of management chain after that is this is what we've heard from our stakeholders. This is what we're doing about it. And we want to make sure that you're both bought in and you're willing to support us with resourcing, budget, whatever we need to go achieve this, right? Because like this stuff doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? It's going to affect backlogs. It's going to affect,
Right.
sometimes you need to go buy some stuff. Sometimes you'll need additional infrastructure. Sometimes you'll need additional engineers. Like there's all sorts of stuff where like, yeah, you're going to need to have conversations with your management chain for however far that goes. And then inside the team, I do genuinely think this one gets skipped a lot because of folks not treating them as feedback mechanisms for teams to get better. It's really important to have the conversation with the team so that they can think about how they want to solve the problem themselves, right? So normally the way that I think about that is like I definitely want to be aligned with the stakeholders and leadership on like that business outcome metric. And then inside the team, you generate how you're going to tilt it. So like what the target metric and what the guardrails are. Because you go into the team and you're like, they need us to change this. How do we want to fix it? Because if you walk in and you just like dictate, this is a target now, people don't normally line up that well against that.
Right. Right. And I think like it's also important to have the metrics which are something more tangible that can be changed
Right.
or improved, right? And I think that's also something worth noting too. Okay, so we collected requirements, we kind of like, started capturing some of these metrics while making sure that we have also capturing their guardrails. And now we have set up a plan. Okay, we can improve these metrics while staying in these guardrails, and this is kind of like how the better world would look like. um, the one part which I think we haven't really touched as much on is the quality, which can sometimes be really hard to measure, right? Like, I think when we say the code quality is really bad, like there is a lot of like technical debt in the company, which I think almost, if you say ask any developer out there who's worked in any reasonable size company, you'll ask, is there technical debt? The unanimous answer is going to be yes.
Mm-hmm.
And I think every company has a different way of even understanding this thing.
Mm-hmm.
And this is only just one type of quality metric. But I'm also still curious from when we're talking about metric designing, are there ways to understand the qualitative side of engineering productivity and like metrics?
I'm going to start with a slightly spicy take that I think technical debt is a term that magically has even less meaning than productivity metrics. It's so hard to make anything in that tractable. I don't use technical debt as a thing in my language anymore. But
Interesting.
um, that'd be like a whole other podcast to talk about that. I think what you're getting at, I think this is a really important point, is that the metrics are just, we're inspecting the system and we've got a quantitative view of flow. And then in a lot of companies, and again, there are actually products that do this. Yeah, the qualitative view is normally like survey based, right? It's like there's some amount of survey. Now, you can't do that as often as you can inspect a build pipeline, because like developers don't want to fill out a survey every day about how they feel about work. And also that wouldn't be statistically significant, because I'm going to go ahead and guess that you'd get different answers on Monday versus Friday, like just, generally speaking. But yeah, you want to have some sort of um, either a survey, or it can just be like an anecdote collection mechanism. I've seen surveys sort of end up getting used as metrics, and that's a really like problematic thing to do. Just theoretically, like qualitative data is not quantitative. And so if you start like doling on like your qualitative like survey data, it gets really messy. And it's just really difficult to kind of deal with. Ultimately, your platform, that it's a product. You've got customers. There are other engineers in the company. Like, there's always a customer relationship. Sit down with your customers and be like, do you like this? Do you not like this? What sucks? Like always just go do the product work. And so yeah, I think you can do surveys, but I also just like making sure that folks know how to talk to you. There was someone I worked with who way back in the day was at AWS, and I don't know if they still have this, but apparently they used to have this like little embedded like frame on all of their internal dev tools that was like literally
Mhm.
just a box, and it had a smiley face and a frowny face and a text box. And so whatever, and basically like it would capture whatever you were on, and you could just be like, I enjoyed this, I didn't enjoy this, quick description as to why. And I always loved that, because it was like, what like a gift of just like the most simple feedback you could possibly gather to give you a view as to like, am I getting smiley faces or am I getting frowny faces?
Like just in time feedback.
Right. Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah.
I mean, given that you're talking about like qualitative and quantitative metrics, I just realized an interesting aspect is the most quantitative metric we generally talk about, the gold standard, is Dora metrics.
Mhm.
And the way Dora metrics are defined and collected is through surveys, which
Yes.
is a qualitative metric.
Yes. It is a really interesting nuance. I mean, I love that you called it out, because yeah, it's certainly a thing that I think when folks read the Dora report, they don't necessarily follow that. Like, it is sort of a subtle nuance. Um, that you're like, yeah, okay, so how good is the survey data? Like, how accurate is this as a representation of the quantitative data on the other side of those orgs? That's tough to know. They do it at enough scale, it's probably fine, right?
Right. Interesting. Okay, maybe one last question around this would be, well, we might have multiple, but if we have multiple problems in engineering org around, like, improving performance or efficiency, which is most likely the case, you don't always have only one problem in the company, how should one think about prioritizing?
That really should come down to a conversation with the broader like business. I mean, fundamentally, you're basically always looking at one of two reasons to do something. We can make a lot more money if we do it this way. Like we can add more value for some definition of value. Or we've got risk that is emerging to a level of unacceptable and we have to go deal with it. Like those are basically your two reasons. And those are the only two reasons that anything should ever really get booked. And yes, that then means that we're going to have this like large landscape of stuff where we're like, well, kind of prioritizing it, and that's fine.
Right.
Like fundamentally, it's going to come down to you've got a shared understanding of value that you think, and you should always go back and check if you got the value that you thought you were going to get. Like that's a really important feedback mechanism. Or like risk, and risk can be we're shedding customers, our infrastructure costs are growing, quadratically with our user base. Like we will go bankrupt if we don't like solve this.
Right. Yeah. I think this is actually a very important point, probably also just re-emphasizing that everything that we are doing in the developer experience or productivity function has to again tie to the business goals.
Yes.
Right. Because eventually, as an software organization, the goal is to deliver value to the customer.
Yes.
Right. So if it does not help you deliver value to the customer better, faster, cheaper, it probably is not worth investing into. Right. And kind of like actually improving software experience, developer experience is an important part of it, because that's how developers are able to execute better. So that's kind of like eventually tied to the business goals. But it's also important to be able to connect that value stream.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and I think it's also why, a little bit, as we talked about right at the top, like why do folks really get into this? It's like, well, your engineers are expensive. They're one of your biggest costs always, right? So you're trying to figure out like, are we getting appropriate ad from these folks? You should be asking that question, but you should be trying to ask it sort of like in how are we prioritizing what we do, not how we think about benchmarking the teams against each other, right? Like it's a very different focus. As you think about solving the problem.
Wrapping up with this, Adam, maybe one question we can ask and maybe leave it open for interpretation is, do you think things are going to get better or worse in terms of how engineering organizations think about productivity or measuring productivity?
I think we're on the precipice of a pretty big shift in how engineering is done. When that's true, it's nearly always worse in the short term and better in the long term. I think that's kind of like my view of this, like overall. But yeah, I think better is available. I think we've just got to all kind of like dig in and kind of understand more what we're tackling.
Okay, I think that's a good way to end this. So yet again, amazing conversation, Adam, as always. So thank you so much for your time, and hope you have a great rest of the day and a weekend.
Thanks, Ankit. This is great.